Hey there, wonderful viewers. If you're enjoying my content, please take a second to hit that like button. It really helps the YouTube algorithm show my videos to more people. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Now grab your favorite drink, sit back, relax, and let's dive into today's story. I promise it'll be worth your time. I was 15 when I went camping with my dad in the Bankhead National Forest in Alabama during the particularly bitter winter of 2022. What had started as a father-son bonding trip quickly devolved into something I still struggle to comprehend. We'd arrived later than planned at our campsite, the afternoon sun already beginning its hasty retreat behind the dense tree line. Dad was always methodical about setting up camp, tent positioned to block the wind, sleeping bags laid out with precision, food secured in bear-proof containers even though black bears in this region typically hibernate during winter. I admired his thoroughness, though at the time I'd rolled my eyes at what I deemed excessive caution. Better to be over-prepared than under-prepared. Theo, he'd say, noticing my impatience. By nightfall, our modest fire had dwindled to glowing embers that cast faint, dancing shadows across our small clearing. The woods around us had fallen into an unsettling silence, the usual ambient sounds of nature muffled by the frost that blanketed everything. Even the wind seemed to have stopped, leaving an unnatural stillness that made the hair on my arms stand despite the layers I wore. Dad checked his watch. It's getting late. We should turn in if we want to get an early start on that ridge trail tomorrow. I nodded, zipping up my jacket tighter as we began our pre-sleep routine. The temperature had dropped significantly after sundown, the cold air burning my lungs with each breath. We were about to crawl into our sleeping bags when we heard it. A low, drawn-out rasping sound cut through the stillness of the forest. It was distant but distinct, something between a groan and a wheeze carrying through the trees with unnerving clarity. Dad and I froze, locking eyes across our dying campfire. His expression shifted from confusion to concern in an instant. "Must be the wind," he offered, though his voice had tightened noticeably, betraying his own uncertainty. We remained motionless, straining to listen. For several long seconds, nothing but silence surrounded us. I had almost convinced myself it had been my imagination when the sound came again. Louder this time, more deliberate. An elongated, agonized groan that seemed to seep through the trees like frigid water. Then a third time, the sound so eerie that I felt my body temperature drop. This wasn't an animal call I recognized, nor was it the creaking of trees or the howling of wind. This was distinctly human. "Dad," I whispered, my voice barely audible even to my own ears. "What was that?" He was already reaching for the heavy-duty flashlight we'd packed. "I don't know, but someone might be hurt." His jaw was set in determination, but I could see apprehension in his eyes. "Grab that walking stick, Theo. Stay close." I snatched the sturdy oak branch we'd used for hiking earlier that day, gripping it so tightly my knuckles whitened. Whatever courage I possessed came not from bravery, but from fear of being left alone at the campsite. We moved cautiously away from our clearing, the beam of Dad's flashlight cutting through the darkness like a blade. The frozen ground crunched beneath our boots, each step sounding impossibly loud in the quiet forest. The bitter cold stung my cheeks and numbed my nose while my breath formed thick clouds that momentarily obscured my vision. The groaning came again, closer now, guiding us through the trees. My heart hammered against my ribs as we crested a small hill, and the flashlight beam fell upon a figure on the ground about 30 yards ahead. It was a woman. She lay sprawled on the incline, head pointing downhill, her body largely motionless save for slight movements accompanying those terrible sounds emanating from her throat. The whole forest seemed to hold its breath as we approached her, an unnatural hush falling over everything. A profound sense of wrongness settled in my gut, the kind of instinctual warning that predates rational thought. Dad knelt beside her, angling the flashlight to illuminate her face without blinding her. I hung back slightly, clutching my makeshift weapon, uncertain of what we'd stumbled upon. Her eyes were unfocused, glassy pools that reflected the flashlight beam without truly seeing it. Her dark hair was matted with frost, and her clothes, inadequate for the freezing temperatures, were wet from prolonged contact with the snow. When she attempted to speak, her words came out slurred and nearly unintelligible. "Help. Please," she managed. her lips blue from the cold. "We're here to help," Dad assured her, already shrugging off his outer jacket to place over her. "What's your name?" What happened? Through fragmented sentences and confused mumbling, we pieced together her story. Her name was Heather. She'd been camping with her boyfriend Thomas at a site about a mile from ours. They'd gotten into a heated argument after both had been drinking heavily. In his anger, Thomas had stormed off with their car keys, leaving her alone in the woods with no transportation. In her intoxicated state, she'd spotted the faint glow of our campfire in the distance and decided to bring us some of their remaining firewood as a peace offering or exchange for help. But disoriented by alcohol and darkness, she had slipped on the icy terrain and fallen, too weak and impaired to get back up. The groaning we'd heard had been her desperate attempts to call for help, her condition preventing her from producing anything more coherent. Dad carefully helped her to a sitting position, though it was immediately clear she wouldn't be walking far on her own. She was hypothermic, dangerously intoxicated, and showing early signs of frostbite on her fingers. "We need to get you warmed up," Dad said, his voice calm but urgent. "Can you tell us how to get back to your campsite?" Heather gestured vaguely eastward, mumbling something about a big rock and blue tent. With considerable effort, we managed to get her upright between us, practically carrying her as we followed her slurred directions. It took nearly 40 minutes to locate her campsite, where a hastily erected blue tent stood beside a stone fire ring, containing nothing but cold ashes. The site was in disarray, camping equipment scattered haphazardly, empty bottles strewn about. The signs of their argument were evident. We got her inside the tent and into her sleeping bag, adding Dad's emergency thermal blanket for extra warmth. I collected wood while Dad revived her fire, both of us working quickly to combat her hypothermia. "Thomas will come back," she slurred as the fire began to crackle. "He always comes back." Dad and I exchanged glances. Leaving her alone seemed dangerous, but we had limited options. The nearest ranger station was hours away, and neither of us had cell service. After ensuring she was as comfortable and warm as possible, Dad made the difficult decision. "Heather, we'll check on you first thing in the morning," he promised. "Try to stay warm and don't leave the tent. Your boyfriend will probably return soon." She nodded weakly, already drifting toward an alcohol-induced sleep that worried me more than comforted me. As we made our way back to our own campsite, guided by moonlight and our flashlight, Dad's expression was troubled. "Not much else we can do tonight," he said, though it sounded like he was trying to convince himself more than me. "She should be okay until morning if she stays put." But I couldn't shake the image of her lying alone in the darkness, producing those terrible sounds, slowly freezing to death. If we hadn't heard her, if we'd dismissed those groans as just another strange forest noise, back at our tent neither of us slept well that night. The forest had lost its peaceful quality, instead feeling watchful and threatening. Every crack of a branch or whisper of wind had me bolt upright, imagining Heather wandering deliriously through the trees or something worse lurking in the darkness beyond our tent. Dawn arrived with reluctant gray light filtering through the frost-covered nylon of our tent. I had managed only fractured sleep, plagued by dreams of disembodied groans and frozen bodies. Dad looked equally exhausted, the lines around his eyes more pronounced as he checked his watch. 6:15, he mumbled, rubbing his face. "Let's check on Heather before we do anything else." We prepared quickly, skipping our usual morning coffee ritual in favor of a faster departure. The forest looked different in daylight, less menacing but somehow more deceptive, as though its picturesque winter beauty concealed darker truths. The trek to Heather's campsite felt shorter in the morning light. As we approached, I noticed something immediately wrong. The campfire we'd built for her had completely died out, not even embers remaining. More concerning was the absolute silence emanating from the blue tent. "Heather?" Dad called out, approaching cautiously. When no response came, he unzipped the tent flap and peered inside. I knew something was wrong from the way his shoulders tensed. "She's gone," he said, voice tight with concern. The sleeping bag lay empty, Dad's thermal blanket discarded on the ground. Heather had vanished, but all her belongings remained, including a small backpack containing her wallet and identification. Her boyfriend Thomas hadn't returned either. There was no sign of a vehicle anywhere near the campsite. "Maybe she went looking for him," I suggested, though the words sounded hollow even to me. Dad surveyed the surrounding area with increasing agitation. In her condition, she could barely stand last night. He was right. The idea of Heather navigating the frozen forest alone, still intoxicated and hypothermic, seemed impossible. Yet the alternative explanations that floated through my mind were even more disturbing. We spent the next hour searching the immediate vicinity, calling Heather's name until our voices grew hoarse. The forest swallowed our shouts, returning nothing but mocking echoes. Eventually, Dad made the decision to hike to the ranger station, a 6-mile journey along hazardous winter trails. "We need to report this properly," he said, gathering essential supplies into his day pack. "Someone with actual search and rescue training needs to get involved." I nodded, relieved that authorities would soon take over this increasingly troubling situation. Yet as we secured both our campsite and Heather's before departing, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched from somewhere within the dense tree line. Several times I whirled around, certain I'd caught movement in my peripheral vision, only to find nothing but stillness. The hike to the ranger station was grueling. Ice had formed over parts of the trail, making each step treacherous. The temperature had risen slightly, causing periodic showers of melting ice to rain down from the tree branches above, startling me each time with cold droplets down my neck. When we finally reached the small wooden outpost that served as the ranger station, I felt a surge of relief that quickly dissipated. The station appeared unmanned, a note on the door indicating that rangers were conducting trail maintenance on the southern section of the forest and would return by afternoon. Dad cursed under his breath, something I rarely heard him do. "We'll have to wait," he decided, checking his phone again for service. Still nothing. We settled onto the wooden bench outside the station, sharing a protein bar from Dad's pack. The forest around the station seemed different somehow, more maintained, less wild, yet somehow more sinister in its carefully managed appearance. "Something doesn't feel right about all this," I said, finally breaking the uncomfortable silence. Dad nodded slowly. "I know. I've been thinking the same thing." "Do you think Thomas came back and something happened between them?" I asked, voicing one of the darker scenarios that had been forming in my mind. "I don't know, Theo. But people don't just vanish into thin air, especially not people who were as incapacitated as she was." A sudden thought struck me. Her ID was still there, in her backpack. Should we have brought it with us? Dad sighed. "Probably, but I didn't want to disturb a potential scene any more than necessary." He avoided using the word crime, but I knew what he meant. We waited nearly 3 hours before a Forest Service truck pulled up to the station. 2 rangers emerged, looking surprised to find us there. Dad quickly explained our situation, describing Heather, her condition, and her mysterious disappearance. The rangers exchanged a look I couldn't interpret. "Blue tent? Near Hollow Creek?" the older ranger asked, his weathered face betraying nothing. Dad nodded. "That's right, about 5 miles northeast of here." The younger ranger was already on his radio, requesting backup. Something about his urgency made my stomach knot with dread. "You folks aren't the first to report strange occurrences in that area," the older ranger said carefully, choosing his words with obvious deliberation. "There have been several incidents over the past few years." "Incidents?" Dad echoed, his voice sharper than intended. The ranger nodded grimly. "Missing hikers, abandoned campsites. Most were eventually explained. People getting lost, wildlife. Encounters, campers simply deciding to leave without properly checking out. But a few cases remain open." A sickening realization washed over me. "You think what happened to Heather is connected to these other cases?" "I didn't say that," the ranger responded quickly, too quickly. "But we're going to investigate thoroughly. I need you both to show us exactly where you encountered this woman and where her campsite is located." The next few hours passed in a blur. More rangers arrived, equipment was gathered, and we found ourselves leading a small procession back through the forest toward Heather's campsite. The rangers maintained radio contact with their base, their voices professional but tense. When we arrived at the blue tent, everything was exactly as we'd left it, abandoned and still, with no sign of either Heather or Thomas. The rangers immediately began a systematic search, photographing the site and bagging certain items as evidence. One ranger discovered something that made him call his colleagues over immediately. Marks in the frozen earth near the back of the tent that looked like drag marks, partially obscured by a fresh dusting of snow, but still discernible. "These are recent," he said, snapping photographs. "Within the last 12 hours. Dad and I watched from a distance as they followed the trail of disturbed snow and soil. It led about 50 yards into the forest, before abruptly stopping at the base of a large oak tree. The rangers spent considerable time examining this area, their expressions growing increasingly troubled. "What did they find?" I whispered to Dad. "I don't know," he replied, his voice strained. "But I think we should prepare ourselves. This might be worse than we thought." One of the rangers approached us, notepad in hand. "I need to ask you both some more specific questions about last night," he said. His tone was professional but had taken on a gravity that hadn't been there before. "Of course," Dad agreed. "You said the woman, Heather, mentioned an argument with her boyfriend. Did she provide any details about the nature of this argument?" Dad shook his head. "She was very disoriented. Just mentioned they'd been drinking and fighting." "And you're certain she said he drove away? She specifically mentioned a car?" "Yes," I interjected, remembering clearly. "She said he took the car keys." The ranger made a note, looking troubled. "We haven't found any vehicle tracks on any of the access roads that would indicate a car recently entered or exited this part of the forest." A cold sensation crept up my spine that had nothing to do with the winter air. "What are you saying?" "I'm not saying anything definitive yet," the ranger replied carefully, "but either the boyfriend didn't leave by car or Heather wasn't telling us the truth," Dad finished for him. The ranger nodded grimly. "We need to consider all possibilities at this point." As the afternoon wore on, more disturbing details emerged. The rangers' search expanded, and they discovered items belonging to Heather scattered in a pattern that suggested she had been moving, or been moved, deeper into the forest. A sock here, a watch there, creating a trail that seemed deliberately placed. "Like breadcrumbs," I overheard one ranger say to another, his voice hushed but carrying in the still forest air. By evening, the situation had escalated considerably. More personnel arrived, including state police officers. Dad and I were asked to provide formal statements, our casual camping trip now officially part of an investigation. "We're going to need you both to leave the forest tonight," the lead officer informed us. "This is now an active investigation area." Dad nodded, looking simultaneously relieved and concerned. "Of course. But is there any way you can keep us updated on what you find?" The officer hesitated. "I can take your contact information, but I should be clear. This may be connected to other cases we're investigating. Information might be limited." As we packed up our campsite under the watchful eyes of a ranger assigned to escort us out, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being told only a fraction of what the authorities suspected. The rangers' carefully neutral expressions couldn't completely mask their concern, and I noticed how they constantly scanned the tree line, hands never straying far from their sidearms. Our escort ranger was taciturn during most of our hike back to the parking area, but as we approached my dad's truck, he finally spoke candidly. "Look, I probably shouldn't say this, but there have been 6 disappearances in this section of Bankhead over the last 3 years. Not all reported properly, not all connected officially, but locals know. There's something not right about this part of the forest." Dad secured our gear in the truck bed. "What do you mean, not right?" The ranger glanced around, ensuring we were alone. "People vanish, but their belongings stay behind. Arranged sometimes, like someone's playing a game." He cleared his throat. "The official line is isolated incidents, exposure, animal attacks, hikers getting lost. But some of us have our doubts." I felt sick. "You think someone's out there taking people?" "I didn't say that." The ranger backtracked quickly, echoing his colleague from earlier. "Just be careful where you choose to camp in the future. Some places aren't as safe as they look." As we drove away from Bankhead National Forest that evening, I watched the trees recede in the side mirror, their dense silhouettes merging into an impenetrable wall of darkness. I couldn't help but wonder if someone or something was watching us leave, already planning their next move in whatever macabre game was being played in those hollow woods. The drive home to Huntsville was tense and largely silent. Dad gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity, his usual road trip chatter conspicuously absent. I stared out the passenger window at the darkening landscape, my mind replaying the events of the past 24 hours on an endless loop. Should we have done more? I finally asked, breaking the uncomfortable silence. For Heather, I mean. Dad sighed deeply, his exhale fogging slightly in the truck's cabin despite the heater running full blast. I've been asking myself the same question, Theo. But what else could we have done? We found her, got her warm, took her back to her campsite. We checked on her first thing in the morning. We could have stayed with her, I suggested, though even as I said it I recognized the impracticality. In her boyfriend's tent? 2 strangers watching over her while she slept? Dad shook his head. That wouldn't have been appropriate, and you know it. We made the best decision we could with the information we had. He was right, of course, but rationality did little to assuage the guilt that had taken root in my chest. The image of Heather's disoriented, frost-tinged face kept surfacing in my thoughts, followed inevitably by imaginings of what might have happened after we left her, images made more disturbing by their lack of clarity. When we finally pulled into our driveway around 9 that evening, Mom was waiting anxiously on the porch. Dad must have called her from the road when I'd dozed off briefly. "Thank God you're both okay," she said, embracing each of us tightly. "Come inside and tell me everything." We recounted the story over hastily prepared sandwiches at the kitchen table, Mom's expression growing increasingly concerned as we described the Rangers' reactions and the hints of previous disappearances. "They're not letting campers into that section of the forest anymore," Dad explained, "at least temporarily. The ranger who escorted us out said they'd be conducting a thorough search operation over the next few days." "And they think this is connected to other missing persons cases?" Mom asked, her clinical psychologist's mind already analyzing patterns. "They wouldn't say officially," Dad replied, but reading between the lines, "Yes, I think they do." That night sleep eluded me despite my exhaustion. My bedroom, usually a haven of comfort, felt exposed and vulnerable. Every creak of the house settling sent my heart rate spiking, and the shadows in the corners seemed deeper, more concealing than usual. When I finally did drift off near dawn, my dreams were filled with groaning voices in blue tents empty of their occupants. The next morning, a Sunday, brought a knock at our door. 2 state police officers stood on our porch, their expressions professionally neutral. "Mr. Bennett? We'd like to ask you and your son a few follow-up questions about the incident in Bankhead Forest," the female officer stated once Dad had invited them in. We sat in our living room, the formality of the interview making our home feel suddenly unfamiliar. They asked for specific details, exact times, precise locations, verbatim recollections of Heather's statements. They showed us photographs of several individuals asking if any resembled Heather, or matched her description. "This one," I said, pointing to a woman with dark hair and a slight build. Her face was thinner, I think, but the eyes looked similar. The officers exchanged glances. "That's Madeline Winters," the male officer explained. "She was reported missing from a camping trip in Bankhead 14 months ago. Never found." A chill settled over the room. Dad leaned forward. "Are you saying we didn't encounter someone named Heather at all? That it was this missing woman?" "We're not saying that definitively," the female officer clarified. "But physical descriptions match and the location is consistent with where Ms. Winters was last seen." "But that's impossible," I protested. "Heather, or whoever she was, told us about her boyfriend Thomas, about their fight that same night. If this woman went missing over a year ago, people in extreme distress, especially suffering from hypothermia and intoxication, can become confused about time and events," the male officer explained gently. "Or," he didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung in the air like smoke, "or she was deliberately misleading you." The officers continued, showing us more photographs, some of missing persons, others of evidence collected from various sites within the forest. One photo made my stomach lurch, a blue tent, nearly identical to the one we'd found Heather in, photographed at what was clearly a different location. This tent was found abandoned in October 2021, About 3 miles from where you encountered the woman you called Heather, the female officer explained. The occupant, a solo hiker named Gregory Whitman, was never located. What are you suggesting? Dad asked, his voice strained. The male officer closed his folder. At this point, we're exploring all possibilities. One theory is that someone is using abandoned equipment from previous victims to establish temporary sites. You mean like a trap? I blurted out, the horror of the implication hitting me full force. We didn't say that, the female officer replied quickly, echoing the forest ranger's careful, non-committal responses. But we are concerned about certain patterns emerging in these cases. They left us with their cards and a request to call immediately if we remembered any additional details, no matter how insignificant they might seem. After they departed, Dad and I sat in stunned silence, the weight of their implied theories pressing down on us. They think someone is hunting people in that forest, I finally said, giving voice to the conclusion neither officer had been willing to state explicitly. Dad didn't contradict me. They're investigating that possibility, yes. And we walked right into the middle of it, I continued, a tremor entering my voice. If we hadn't heard her groaning, if we hadn't gone to investigate... Don't, Dad cut me off firmly. Don't go down that road, Theo. We did hear her, we did investigate, and we're safe. Focus on that. But safety felt like an illusion now, a thin veneer easily shattered. The familiar world had acquired an overlay of potential threat that I couldn't unsee. In the days that followed, I compulsively checked news outlets for information about the investigation. Local coverage was surprisingly minimal. Brief mentions of an ongoing search operation in Bankhead National Forest, with authorities requesting that the public avoid certain trails. Nothing about missing campers, nothing about Heather or Thomas or any pattern of disappearances. The lack of information felt deliberate, as though authorities were containing knowledge of whatever was happening in those woods. A week after our return, Dad received a phone call from Detective Rivera, one of the officers who had interviewed us. He took the call in his study, emerging 20 minutes later with a troubled expression. They found something, didn't they? I asked immediately. Dad nodded slowly. They found a car hidden about half a mile from where Heather's campsite was, covered with branches and forest debris. It's registered to a Thomas Keller from Nashville. My heart raced. So there really was a Thomas. He didn't leave her after all. No, he didn't, Dad confirmed grimly. His body was in the trunk. The blunt statement hit me like a physical blow. I sank onto the couch trying to process this horrific development. They think he'd been dead for at least 48 hours before we even encountered Heather, Dad continued, his voice clinical in the way it got when he was trying to distance himself emotionally from disturbing information, which means he was already dead when she told us he'd driven away after their fight. She lied to us, I whispered, remembering Heather's glazed eyes, her slurred speech. Had her disorientation been an act? Or had she been as much a victim as Thomas, forced to play some role in a game I couldn't begin to comprehend? The detective couldn't share many details, Dad said, sitting heavily beside me. But they're treating this as a homicide investigation now, not just a missing persons case. Did they find Heather? I asked, already guessing the answer. No trace of her. Dad rubbed his face wearily. They're considering the possibility that she was abducted, or that she might have been involved in Thomas's death. I remembered the ranger's words. People vanish, but their belongings stay behind. Arranged sometimes, like someone's playing a game. What about the other missing people? I asked. The ones the rangers hinted about? Dad shook his head. Detective Rivera wouldn't confirm any connection officially. Just said the investigation is expanding in scope. That night I dreamed of Heather again, but this time she wasn't lying helpless in the snow. Instead, she stood perfectly straight at the edge of our campsite, watching silently as Dad and I slept. In the dream, I awoke to find her leaning over me, her previously unfocused eyes now sharp and aware, her blue-tinged lips curled in a slight smile. You should have stayed at your campsite, Dream Heather whispered. Some things in these woods aren't meant to be found. I woke gasping, sheets twisted around me like restraints, the memory of her voice still ringing in my ears despite having only existed in my dream. 2 days later, the local news finally broke a more substantial story. Multiple disappearances in Bankhead National Forest under investigation. The article was light on, specifics but confirmed that authorities were investigating several related incidents over a 3-year period. A brief statement from the FBI indicated they were now assisting local law enforcement, suggesting the case had escalated significantly. Compelled by a need I couldn't articulate, I began researching previous disappearances in Bankhead Forest, starting with Madeline Winters, the woman whose photograph had resembled Heather. What I found disturbed me deeply. Over the past 5 years, at least 9 people had gone missing while hiking or camping in the northeastern section of the forest. Some cases had been attributed to misadventure, exposure to elements, accidents, wildlife encounters, but several remained unsolved. I created a timeline, mapping the disappearances against locations in the forest. A pattern emerged. They formed a rough circle with a radius of about 3 miles, centered on an area marked on forestry maps as Hollow Creek Junction, the same area where we had found Heather. When I showed my research to Dad, his face paled. "Theo, I think you need to step back from this," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "The authorities are handling the investigation. But don't you see?" I insisted, pointing to my map. "There's a clear pattern here, and we were right in the middle of it. We might have information that could help them understand what's happening." Dad studied my work with obvious reluctance. "I'll call Detective Rivera again," he finally conceded. "See if this is something they're already aware of." The detective arrived at our house that evening, accepting my compiled research with professional courtesy that didn't quite mask her concern. She spent nearly an hour reviewing my findings, occasionally asking clarifying questions or making notes. "You've got good analytical skills," she finally said, closing her notebook. "And yes, we've identified a similar geographical pattern. So there is someone operating in that specific area," I pressed, feeling vindicated despite the horror of the situation. Detective Rivera chose her words carefully. "We're pursuing multiple theories. One involves a human perpetrator or perpetrators using the remote terrain to their advantage. And the other theories?" Dad asked. "Some evidence suggests the involvement of a group rather than an individual," she replied, sidestepping the question. "Beyond that, I can't comment on ongoing investigative avenues." After she left, taking copies of my research with her, Dad turned to me with an expression I'd rarely seen, a mixture of pride and deep concern. "I understand your need to make sense of what we experienced," he said. "But I'm worried about your involvement in this, Theo. This isn't a mystery novel. It's a real investigation into dangerous events." "I know that," I replied defensively. "That's why I'm trying to help." "And you have helped," Dad assured me. "But now it's time to let the professionals handle it." "Promise me you'll step back from this," I promised, intending to honor my word. But that night, an email arrived from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line read simply, "You were there. You saw." My finger hovered over the delete button. This was exactly the kind of involvement Dad had warned against. But curiosity overwhelmed caution, and I opened the message. It contained only a single sentence. "Not all who wander the hollow woods are lost. Some are hunting." Below this cryptic statement was an image, a photograph of a blue tent, identical to the one we'd found Heather in. But what made my blood freeze was the background. Behind the tent, barely visible in the tree line, stood a figure watching the campsite. The image was grainy, taken from a distance, but I could make out enough to recognize the dark hair and slim build of a woman who could have been Heather. She wasn't alone in the woods after all. And whatever game was being played in Bankhead Forest, I was now unmistakably part of it. I stared at the email for what felt like hours, my mind racing through possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. Who had sent this? How did they know I'd been in Bankhead Forest? How did they get my email address? The timestamp on the email showed it had been sent at 3:17 a.m., which only added to its unsettling nature. I checked the image properties, hoping for metadata that might reveal something about its origin, but all identifying information had been stripped. Whoever had sent this knew enough to cover their digital tracks. After wrestling with my conscience, I finally decided I couldn't keep this to myself. Despite my promise to Dad about stepping back from the investigation, this email had come to me directly. It felt targeted, personal. I printed the email and image before knocking on my parents' bedroom door despite the late hour. "Theo, Mom answered, looking concerned at my obvious distress. "What's wrong?" Dad appeared behind her, instantly alert. "What happened?" I wordlessly handed them the printout. Dad's expression darkened as he examined the image while Mom gasped softly. "When did you get this?" Dad demanded, suddenly looking like the structural engineer he was, analyzing a potentially catastrophic failure. "About an hour ago," I admitted. "I don't know who sent it or how they found me." Dad was already reaching for his phone. "I'm calling Detective Rivera. This crosses a line." Within 45 minutes, 2 police officers were at our house, bagging my laptop as evidence and taking statements. They were followed shortly by Detective Rivera herself, who interviewed me extensively about the email. "Have you received any other unusual communications? Friend requests from strangers? Messages on social media?" she asked, her pen poised over her notebook. I shook my head. "Nothing. I've been pretty quiet online since we got back from camping." "The email address uses Proton Mail," she noted, "an encrypted service that's difficult to trace. This suggests someone with technical knowledge who's deliberately trying to stay anonymous." "But why contact me at all?" I asked, the question that had been plaguing me since I'd opened the message. "What's the point?" Detective Rivera studied me for a moment before answering. "Sometimes perpetrators seek connection with investigations into their activities. It provides a sense of control, of playing both sides of the game." She hesitated before adding, "Or they may see you as someone who understands what they're doing." The implication made me feel physically ill. "I don't understand anything about what's happening in those woods." "Which is precisely why this contact is concerning," she replied. "Your family needs to be extra vigilant now. No unusual routines, no isolated activities. We'll have patrols increase their presence in your neighborhood." After she left, my parents instituted immediate security measures, checking locks obsessively, installing a new alarm system, and implementing a strict no-one-goes-anywhere-alone policy. Dad even took time off work to drive me to and from school, something I hadn't needed since freshman year. The days that followed were tense, filled with jumpy reactions to normal sounds and suspicious glances at unfamiliar cars that passed our house. My laptop was eventually returned, scrubbed and examined by cyber forensics, but I couldn't look at it without remembering that cryptic message. "Not all who wander the hollow woods are lost, some are hunting." What did it mean? Were there multiple people involved in whatever was happening in Bankhead Forest? The ambiguity of hunting troubled me most. Hunting for what or whom? 2 weeks after receiving the email, when no further contact had come, life began to settle into an uneasy new normal. Detective Rivera called periodically with brief, uninformative updates that amounted to little more than, "The investigation continues." The lack of progress or concrete information was maddening. Then came the package. It arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, a small padded envelope addressed to me by name with no return address. Mom, who had become hyper-vigilant about anything unusual, called Dad immediately. "Don't open it," he instructed when he got home, examining the package with suspicious eyes. "I'm calling Detective Rivera." The detective arrived within the hour, bringing along an officer with expertise in suspicious packages. After determining it contained no explosives or harmful materials, she carefully opened it wearing gloves. Inside was a single USB drive and a handwritten note that read, "What the authorities won't tell you." Detective Rivera's expression remained neutral, but I detected a flicker of concern. "We'll need to examine this before you can access it," she said, bagging both items as evidence. "What if it contains information about Heather?" I asked, unable to hide my frustration. "Or about what's happening in those woods?" "Then we'll handle it appropriately," she replied firmly. "But this could just as easily be an attempt to plant malware on your devices, or to further intimidate your family." She was right, of course, but rationality did little to quell my burning curiosity. What information could be on that drive that the authorities were supposedly concealing? 3 days later, Detective Rivera returned to our house looking troubled. She sat with my parents and me at our kitchen table, her usual professional demeanor slightly frayed. "The USB drive contained photographs," she began carefully. "Images from Bankhead Forest taken over the past 4 years. They appear to show surveillance of campsites and hikers." My stomach tightened, like someone was stalking them. She nodded grimly. The images progress chronologically, showing various individuals in the forest. Some are people who later disappeared. Was Heather in them? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Yes, Detective Rivera confirmed. Both Heather Wilson and Thomas Keller appear in photos dated 3 days before you encountered her. So they were being watched before whatever happened to Thomas, Dad said, his engineer's mind connecting the sequential dots. It appears so, she agreed. But what's more concerning is that the most recent photographs on the drive. She trailed off, meeting my parents' eyes with a grave expression. The most recent photographs are of your family. Specifically of you and Theo at your campsite the night you found Heather. Mom gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Dad's face hardened into stone. Someone was watching us that night? I asked, my voice cracking with the horrifying realization. While we slept? Detective Rivera nodded solemnly. It appears that whoever is behind these incidents observed your interaction with Heather and has now taken an interest in your family, particularly in Theo. Why me? I demanded, fear mingling with confused anger. What did I do? It may not be anything you did, she explained gently. Sometimes perpetrators of serial crimes develop fixations on witnesses or those who intersect with their activities. They may see you as someone who glimpsed their work and lived to tell about it. This has gone too far, Dad declared, his voice tight with controlled fury. We need to consider relocating temporarily. That might be advisable, Detective Rivera agreed. At minimum, I would recommend staying with relatives outside the area until we make more progress in the investigation. And what about school? I protested, though the objection felt hollow even to me, overshadowed by the knowledge that someone had been watching us, photographing us without our knowledge. Your safety comes first, Mom said firmly, her psychologist's composure momentarily cracking. We'll work with your teachers on remote learning options. That evening, as I packed for our hastily arranged stay with my aunt in Birmingham, I noticed a folded piece of paper that had been slipped under my bedroom window. My heart racing, I unfolded it with trembling fingers. Written in the same handwriting as the note with the USB drive was a single sentence. They won't tell you about the others who came before. I should have immediately shown this to my parents or called Detective Rivera. Instead, driven by an impulse I still can't fully explain, I quickly photographed the note with my phone and then brought it downstairs to show my parents. The distinction feels trivial now. I did report it, after all. But that small act of securing my own copy marked a turning point in my involvement. Within hours, we were on the road to Birmingham, our home locked and under police surveillance. My Aunt Cindy welcomed us with worried embraces and countless questions that my parents answered vaguely, mentioning only a security concern related to a case Dad had encountered while camping. That night, in the unfamiliar guest bedroom of my aunt's suburban home, I found myself unable to sleep. The knowledge that someone had been observing us in the forest, that they knew who I was and where I lived, left me feeling perpetually exposed. Around 3 a.m., I gave up on sleep and opened my laptop, connected to my aunt's Wi-Fi. Acting on an impulse that felt both reckless and necessary, I created a new anonymous email account and I sent a message to the same anonymous inbox. Who are you and what do you want from me? I didn't truly expect a response, certainly not an immediate one. But to my shock, a reply arrived within minutes. Not who, but what. The question isn't who I am, but what happened to Heather and the others. The authorities know more than they're telling you. Search for information on Operation Deadfall if you want the truth. My finger hovered over the reply button, but caution finally asserted itself. I took screenshots of the exchange, then deleted the email account I'd created. Whatever game this person was playing, I wouldn't make myself an easier target. The next morning, bleary-eyed from lack of sleep, I discreetly researched Operation Deadfall while my parents discussed logistics with Aunt Cindy. Most results were references to military operations or hunting techniques, nothing related to Bankhead Forest or missing persons. But on the 4th page of search results, I found a brief mention in a regional news archive from 2019. The article focused on budget allocations for the Alabama Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, but included this single sentence. Additional funding was approved for ongoing surveillance operations, including Operation Deadfall, targeting illegal activities in protected wilderness areas. It wasn't much, but it confirmed the operation was real, some kind of surveillance program in Alabama's wilderness areas. Could it be connected to whatever was happening in Bankhead Forest? I debated whether to share this discovery with my parents or Detective Rivera. On one hand, it seemed like potentially valuable information. On the other, it would reveal that I'd contacted the anonymous emailer against explicit instructions to avoid engagement. Decision was made for me when my phone rang later that day, Detective Rivera calling with an update. We've identified a person of interest in the case, and she informed me, her voice cautiously optimistic. A former Forest Service employee named Victor Harlan. He worked as a trail maintenance supervisor in Bankhead until 2020, when he was dismissed following complaints about erratic behavior. Do you think he's responsible for what happened to Heather and Thomas? I asked. We're not jumping to conclusions, she replied, ever careful with her words. But his knowledge of the forest and its remote areas makes him someone we want to speak with. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to locate him yet. I hesitated, then decided to take the risk. Detective, have you ever heard of something called Operation Deadfall? The silence that followed was brief but telling. When she spoke again, her voice had taken on a new edge. Where did you hear that term, Theo? I explained about the anonymous email and my subsequent research, bracing for a reprimand. Instead, her response surprised me. Operation Deadfall was a joint surveillance initiative between state authorities and the federal government, she explained after a long pause. It began in 2018 following reports of organized criminal activity in remote wilderness areas, including parts of Bankhead Forest. Criminal activity? Like what? I pressed. Initially drug production and trafficking, she replied. Remote forests provide good cover for methamphetamine labs. But during the surveillance, they observed other concerning patterns of behavior unrelated to drug activity. Like people disappearing, I suggested. I can't comment on specific findings, she said, reverting to her more guarded manner. But yes, the operation documented unusual occurrences that later became part of our current investigation. And Victor Harlan? Was he part of Operation Deadfall? Another telling pause. He was interviewed during the operation, she finally acknowledged, as were all Forest Service employees with access to the areas under surveillance. This felt like the first real information I'd received since our ordeal began. Confirmation that there was indeed something systematic happening in those woods, something that authorities had been aware of for years. Why keep this secret? I asked, unable to contain my frustration. If people knew there was danger in those woods. Panic helps no one, Detective Rivera cut in firmly, and premature disclosure of investigative methods can compromise ongoing operations. That's all I can say on this matter, Theo. Please, no more unauthorized communications with whoever is sending these messages. They're attempting to manipulate you for reasons we don't yet understand. After we hung up, I sat on the edge of my aunt's guest bed, processing this new information. Operation Deadfall. Victor Harlan. A surveillance program that had documented unusual occurrences in Bankhead Forest years before our encounter with Heather. The pieces were there, but I couldn't yet see how they fit together. What connected a former Forest Service employee to the disappearances? Why would someone be trying to feed me information about a covert surveillance operation? And most importantly, what had really happened to Heather after we left her at that blue tent? That night I dreamed I was back in Bankhead Forest, but the trees had eyes. Small cameras affixed to their trunks, blinking red lights tracking my movement through the wilderness. In the dream, I followed a trail of blue fabric scraps deeper into the woods, finally arriving at a clearing where dozens of blue tents stood in concentric circles. In the center stood Heather, but when she turned to face me, her features had been replaced by a blank expanse of skin, featureless except for a single red blinking light where her right eye should have been. I awoke drenched in sweat, the image lingering behind my eyelids. Something about the dream tugged at my memory. Not the surreal horror of Heather's featureless face, but something more concrete. Cameras in the trees. Operation Deadfall had been a surveillance program. What if physical evidence of that surveillance still existed in the forest? What if the person contacting me wanted me to find that evidence? The realization felt important, but I had no way to act on it while sequestered in Birmingham. All I could do was compile what I knew and wait for an opportunity to share it with Detective Rivera in person, rather than over potentially monitored phone lines. That opportunity came sooner than expected. 3 days into our stay with Aunt Cindy, Detective Rivera called with news that changed everything. "We've located Victor Harlan," she informed us. "He was found deceased in a remote cabin about 30 miles from Bankhead Forest. Initial evidence suggests suicide, but we're investigating thoroughly." "Did he leave any explanation?" Dad asked, his face grim. "Any confession?" "No note," Detective Rivera replied. "But we found equipment in his possession that connects him to the surveillance photographs you received." "And there's something else." She paused, seeming to weigh her next words carefully. "We found a journal. It contains entries about specific individuals who went missing in Bankhead, including detailed observations of Heather Wilson and Thomas Keller before their incident." "So he was stalking them," I said, the pieces finally falling into place. "He was responsible for the disappearances." "The evidence strongly suggests his involvement," she confirmed. "We're still processing the scene, but at this point we believe the immediate threat to your family has been neutralized." Relief washed over my parents' faces, but I felt strangely unsettled. It seemed too neat, too convenient. The suspect conveniently dead by his own hand, unable to explain his motives or methods. "What about Heather?" I asked. "Have you found any sign of her?" "Not yet," Detective Rivera admitted. "But Harlan's journal contains several references to remote locations in the forest. We're organizing search teams to investigate each one systematically." "And the person who's been contacting me?" I pressed. "Was that Harlan too?" "We're still investigating the source of those communications," she replied, her voice suggesting she considered this a minor loose end. "It's possible Harlan had an accomplice, or someone with knowledge of his activities is attempting to insert themselves into the investigation." When the call ended, my parents were visibly relieved. The nightmare, it seemed, was nearly over. We could return home soon, resume our normal lives, try to put the horror of Bankhead Forest behind us. But that night, as my family celebrated the apparent resolution with takeout pizza and ice cream, I received one last message from the anonymous mail. Harlan was part of it, but not all of it. "The cameras saw everything. The blue tents are markers. This isn't over." Attached was a map image, a section of Bankhead Forest with a location marked by a single red X. I stared at my phone screen, torn between deleting the message and reporting it immediately, or pursuing this final lead that might reveal the complete truth about what had happened in those hollow woods. Choice I made that night would change everything. I deleted the email, not immediately. First, I took screenshots, saved the map image, and forwarded everything to Detective Rivera with a brief explanation. Then I deleted the message and blocked the sender. Whatever game this anonymous correspondent was playing, I was finished being their pawn. Detective Rivera called within minutes of receiving my email. "You did the right thing, Theo," she assured me, her voice tense despite the praise. "We'll investigate this location immediately. Please don't share this with anyone else for now." "Do you think it's legitimate?" I asked. "Or just someone trying to manipulate the investigation?" "Hard to say," she admitted. "But we can't ignore potential evidence, especially if it might lead to finding Heather Wilson or any of the other missing persons." 2 days later, we returned home to Huntsville under police escort. The investigation wasn't officially closed, but with Harlan deceased and no further threatening communications, authorities deemed it safe for us to resume our normal lives with reasonable precautions. I returned to school, where rumors about my brief absence had already spawned wild theories ranging from witness protection to family tragedy. For almost a week, everything seemed to be returning to normal. Detective Rivera called once to inform us that they had investigated the location from the map, but found nothing significant there. She attributed the tip to someone attempting to waste police resources or insert themselves into a high-profile case. I tried to accept this explanation, to believe that with Harlan's death the threat had truly ended, but the final message from the anonymous emailer continued to trouble me. "The cameras saw everything. The blue tents are markers. This isn't over." What if there was something at that location that the police had missed? What if the answers were still out there waiting to be discovered? The thought became an obsession, growing stronger each day until I finally confided in my best friend Wesley. I showed him the screenshots I'd saved, explained the entire bizarre sequence of events, from finding Heather in the woods to the mysterious communications I'd received. "This is seriously messed up," Wesley said when I'd finished, his eyes wide, like horror movie level messed up. "I know," I agreed. "And I can't shake the feeling that there's more to the story than what they're telling us." Harlan's death was too convenient, too neat. Wesley studied the map image on my phone. "So this is where your mystery informant thinks there's evidence?" I nodded. "According to them, yes. And the cops checked it out but found nothing?" "That's what they said." Wesley was quiet for a moment, then looked up with the gleam of adventure in his eyes that I should have recognized as dangerous. "What if we checked it out ourselves?" "Are you insane?" I demanded, though the suggestion had already planted itself in my mind. "After everything that's happened?" "Hear me out," Wesley insisted. "Whatever was happening in those woods, the cops say it's over. Harlan's dead. We'd just be hiking to a specific spot in a national forest, which is completely legal. If we find nothing, no harm done. If we find something the cops missed, we'd be interfering in an active investigation," I pointed out. "Or providing valuable evidence," he countered. "Look, I'm not saying we should go alone. My cousin Jake works as a park ranger in Oak Mountain. He could come with us. He's trained. He carries a sidearm. We'd be completely safe." I should have shut down the idea immediately. I should have remembered my promise to my parents to stay away from anything related to the Bankhead case. Instead, I found myself considering the logistics. How would we even get there? "My parents are watching me like hawks." Wesley grinned. "Tell them you're coming to my house for a study session and overnight. My parents are out of town this weekend visiting my grandma. Jake can pick us up Saturday morning. We make a day trip to Bankhead and we're back by Sunday afternoon. No one ever has to know." It was reckless, potentially dangerous, and exactly what part of me had been wanting to do since receiving that final message. The prospect of finally getting answers, of seeing for myself what the police might have missed, was too tempting to resist. "Okay," I heard myself say. "Let's do it." The plan came together with surprising ease. My parents, eager for signs of me returning to normal teenage life, readily agreed to the supposed study session at Wesley's house. Jake, Wesley's 24-year-old cousin, required more convincing, but eventually agreed after hearing a sanitized version of our story that emphasized our archaeological interest in some unusual structures in the forest. That Saturday morning found us in Jake's Jeep, driving the winding roads toward Bankhead National Forest. Jake was tall and fit, with the sun-weathered complexion of someone who spent his days outdoors. His ranger uniform and the holstered pistol at his hip provided a reassuring sense of authority and protection. "So you're sure this location is accessible by trail?" Jake asked as we neared the forest boundary. "I'm not taking you kids bushwhacking through unmarked terrain." "There's a trail most of the way," I assured him, studying the map I'd created by overlaying the anonymous tip onto proper topographical maps of the area. "We might have to go off trail for the last quarter mile or so, but the terrain isn't difficult." Jake nodded, seemingly satisfied. "And you're absolutely sure this is legal educational research? Because if there's anything else going on here, now's the time to tell me." Wesley and I exchanged glances. "Completely legal," Wesley confirmed, technically not lying. "We're just interested in seeing this location for ourselves." As we entered the forest, a familiar uneasiness settled over me. The trees seemed to close in around us, watching, waiting. I reminded myself that it was just my imagination, fueled by the trauma of our previous experience. Victor Harlan was dead. Whatever had happened here was over. We parked at a small trailhead and began our hike. The day was clear and cold, typical for February in northern Alabama. Our breath formed clouds in the air as Jake led the way, setting a brisk pace along the marked trail. "So what exactly are we expecting to find at this mystery location?" Jake asked as we walked. I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. Possibly evidence of some kind of surveillance equipment. There was a research project called Operation Deadfall a few years back, studying wildlife patterns in this area. The partial truth seemed to satisfy Jake, who launched into an explanation of various wildlife research methods used in national forests. Meanwhile, Wesley shot me a questioning look, clearly wondering why I hadn't told Jake the full story. 2 hours into our hike, we reached the point where we needed to leave the marked trail. Jake consulted my map, frowning slightly. "This is getting into pretty remote territory," he observed. "Not many people come out this way." "That's kind of the point," I replied, trying to sound casual. "The researchers would have wanted minimal human interference." Jake seemed to accept this explanation, and we proceeded carefully through the increasingly dense forest. The ground became more uneven, with unexpected dips and rises hidden beneath years of accumulated leaf litter. The silence grew deeper, broken only by our footsteps and the occasional call of a distant bird. According to my calculations, we were less than half a mile from the marked location when Jake suddenly stopped, holding up a hand for us to do the same. "Do you see that?" he asked quietly, pointing toward a dense thicket about 50 yards ahead. At first I saw nothing unusual, just winter-bare trees and dormant underbrush. Then my eyes caught a flash of color, something distinctly unnatural among the browns and grays of the forest. Blue fabric. My heart rate increased instantly. "I see it," I confirmed, my voice barely above a whisper. Jake drew his sidearm, suddenly all business. "Stay behind me," he ordered. "Both of you. Right now." The transformation in his demeanor was immediate and alarming. Whatever he had spotted, it was enough to put him on high alert. We crept forward slowly, Jake leading with his weapon pointed downward but ready. As we approached, the blue fabric became more distinct, a small piece fluttering from a branch, as if deliberately placed. It appeared to be torn from something larger, perhaps a tent or tarp. Jake stopped again, his eyes scanning the surrounding area with professional intensity. "Something's not right here," he murmured. "This feels staged." The word sent a chill through me. Staged. Like someone was playing a game. Beyond the blue fabric marker, the terrain sloped downward into a shallow ravine. At the bottom, partially concealed by fallen logs and winter foliage, was something that made my blood run cold. A small surveillance camera mounted on a tree trunk, its lens pointed directly at the approach we had just taken. "Is that part of the wildlife research?" Wesley asked nervously. Jake shook his head slowly. "That's not standard Forest Service equipment." He approached the camera cautiously, examining it without touching. "This is a high-end motion-activated security camera. Weatherproofed, probably satellite uplinked. Can you tell if it's still active?" I asked, fighting to keep my voice steady. Jake studied it for a moment. "The indicator light is off, which usually means it's not recording. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's not operational." He turned to face us, his expression grave. "Okay, I need one of you to explain what's really going on here. Now." I exchanged a glance with Wesley, who nodded encouragingly. Taking a deep breath, I gave Jake the complete story, from finding Heather in the woods to the mysterious communications I'd received, including the references to Operation Deadfall and the surveillance cameras. As I spoke, Jake's expression shifted from skepticism to concern to something approaching alarm. When I finished, he holstered his weapon but maintained a vigilant stance. "So you're telling me this location was sent to you by an anonymous source who might be connected to multiple disappearances in this forest? And you decided to come check it out without telling the police?" "The police did check it out," I defended weakly. "They said they found nothing." Jake gestured toward the camera. "Well, they either missed this or it wasn't here when they looked. Either way, we're leaving. Now. And I'm reporting this as soon as we get back to civilization." He turned to lead us back the way we'd come, but Wesley pointed further down the ravine. "Wait, there's something else down there." About 30 yards further, half hidden by a fallen tree, was something unmistakably man-made. A small concrete structure no larger than a garden shed, with no windows and a metal door secured with a padlock. "That's definitely not Forest Service construction," Jake muttered. "This whole area is supposed to be protected wilderness." "Could it be part of Operation Deadfall?" I suggested. "Some kind of field station for the surveillance program?" Jake hesitated, clearly torn between investigating further and getting us safely away from what was obviously an unauthorized and potentially dangerous situation. "We're just going to take a quick look," he decided finally. "Don't touch anything. Stay behind me. If I say run, you run. Understood?" We nodded solemnly, and Jake led us carefully down the ravine toward the concrete structure. As we approached, I noticed other cameras positioned strategically on surrounding trees, creating a surveillance perimeter around the small building. The concrete structure looked weathered but not abandoned. The padlock showed no signs of rust, and the area immediately around the door was clear of debris, suggesting recent access. "This is way beyond weird," Jake commented, examining the lock without touching it. "This is some kind of unauthorized installation in federal land. Definitely illegal. Can we see inside?" Wesley asked. Jake shook his head. "Not without breaking in, which would be a federal offense. We've seen enough. I'm documenting this with photos and then we're leaving." He took out his phone and began photographing the structure and cameras from various angles. I walked slowly around the perimeter of the small building, noting its solid construction and the absence of any markings or identifiers. As I rounded the back corner, something caught my eye: a small ventilation grate near the ground, partially obscured by overgrown vegetation. Kneeling down, I peered through the grate into darkness. At first, I could see nothing, but as my eyes adjusted, vague shapes became visible inside: shelving units, electronic equipment, and what appeared to be stacks of files or folders. "Guys," I called softly. "There's a vent here. I can see inside." Jake quickly joined me, crouching to look through the grate. "Some kind of monitoring station," he confirmed. "Sophisticated setup too. But for what?" Wesley asked. "Why would anyone need this kind of surveillance out here in the middle of nowhere?" Before Jake could answer, a sound broke the forest silence, the distant but unmistakable sound of a vehicle engine. Jake straightened instantly. "Someone's coming. We need to go now." We hurried back up the ravine, Jake leading us on a different route than we'd taken down, giving the cameras a wide berth. The engine sound grew louder, suggesting a vehicle on one of the remote Forest Service roads that crisscrossed the area. "Stay low and quiet," Jake instructed as we crested the ravine. "We're going to circle back to the main trail without being seen." For 15 tense minutes, we moved stealthily through the forest, Jake navigating with the expertise of an experienced outdoorsman. The engine sounds eventually faded, but Jake maintained our cautious pace until we rejoined the marked trail we'd originally followed. "We're hiking straight back to the Jeep," he announced, his tone allowing no argument. No stops, no detours. The return journey passed in tense silence, each of us processing what we discovered. My mind raced with questions. Who had built that concrete structure? What were they monitoring? Was it connected to Operation Deadfall, to Victor Harlan, to the disappearances? And most disturbing of all, if the police had truly searched that location as Detective Rivera claimed, how had they missed such obvious evidence? When we finally reached Jake's Jeep, he immediately tried to call his supervisor at Oak Mountain, but found no cell service. He drove us out of the forest at a speed that bordered on reckless, clearly eager to put distance between us and what we'd discovered. "Listen to me carefully," he said once we were on the main highway heading back toward Huntsville. "What we found back there isn't normal. It isn't legal. And it isn't something you two should have been anywhere near." "Are you going to tell my parents?" I asked, dreading the inevitable fallout. Jake sighed heavily. "I have to report what we found. That means full disclosure of who was with me and why we were there. So yes, your parents are going to find out." "But we found something important," Wesley argued. "Something the police supposedly looked for but didn't find." "Doesn't that count for anything?" "It counts for putting yourselves in potential danger," Jake retorted. "Whatever's happening in those woods is clearly not something for teenagers to be investigating." When we reached cell service range, Jake pulled over and made 2 calls. First to his supervisor, reporting what we'd found in carefully measured terms, then to the state police, asking specifically to speak with Detective Rivera. I could hear only Jake's side of the conversation, but it was enough to understand that Detective Rivera was not pleased to learn of our expedition to Bankhead Forest. The call ended with Jake agreeing to bring us directly to the police station in Huntsville. "She wants to debrief you personally," he explained as we continued driving. "And she's contacting your parents." My stomach sank. Whatever consequences awaited me would be severe, but in that moment I was more concerned with the implications of what we'd found. If the police had searched that location as claimed but found nothing, either they were incredibly incompetent or they had deliberately concealed what was there. By the time we reached the Huntsville police station, both my parents and Wesley's mother were already waiting, their expressions a mix of fury and profound relief. The reunion was brief and tense, with promises of lengthy discussions to come once the official police business was concluded. Detective Rivera looked exhausted when she finally entered the conference room where we'd been waiting. The past weeks had clearly taken a toll on her. New lines had formed around her eyes, and her customarily impeccable appearance showed signs of neglect. I should begin by saying how incredibly irresponsible and dangerous your actions were today, she stated flatly, addressing Wesley and me directly. You potentially compromised an ongoing federal investigation and put yourselves at significant risk. Federal investigation? I repeated, latching onto this new information. So Operation Deadfall is still active? Detective Rivera's eyes narrowed. What I'm about to share is not for public disclosure, she said, looking pointedly at each person in the room. But given the circumstances, limited transparency may be necessary. She took a seat at the table, folding her hands in front of her. Operation Deadfall began as a joint task force between state authorities and the FBI, monitoring illegal activities in remote wilderness areas. Its original focus was drug trafficking, but over time, evidence emerged of something potentially more disturbing. The disappearances, I supplied. She nodded reluctantly. Patterns began to emerge. Specific locations, similar victim profiles, distinctive methodology. Analysis suggested we might be dealing with a sophisticated predator using the remote terrain to his advantage. Victor Harlan, Dad interjected. Harlan was a person of interest, Detective Rivera confirmed. As a former Forest Service employee, he had intimate knowledge of the terrain and access to remote areas. The surveillance equipment your son discovered today was initially installed to monitor his activities. But if Harlan is dead, why is the equipment still active? I asked. And why did you tell us you found nothing at that location when we clearly saw a concrete structure and multiple cameras today? Detective Rivera's expression tightened. The investigation has evolved. While evidence strongly suggests Harlan's involvement in the disappearances, certain inconsistencies have emerged that indicate he may not have acted alone. You think he had a partner? I realized aloud. Someone who's still out there. That is one theory being explored, she acknowledged cautiously. The surveillance equipment remains in place as part of ongoing efforts to identify any potential accomplices. And you didn't tell us this because... Dad demanded, his protective instincts clearly aroused. Because public knowledge of ongoing surveillance operations could compromise their effectiveness, Detective Rivera replied firmly. And because until today we had no evidence that Theo was still being targeted or manipulated by whoever sent those messages. But I forwarded you the final email with the map, I protested. I did everything right. Yes, you did, she agreed. And we investigated that location thoroughly. The concrete structure you found today was not there when our team searched the area 3 weeks ago. The implication hit me like a physical blow. You're saying someone built that structure after you searched the area? Someone who knew I'd received the tip and might act on it eventually? Detective Rivera's grim expression was answer enough. Which is precisely why your unauthorized expedition today was not just foolish, but potentially played right into someone's hands. But who? Wesley asked, speaking up for the first time since we'd arrived at the station. Who would go to all this trouble? That remains unclear, Detective Rivera admitted. But today's events have provided valuable new information. The photographs Jake took of the installation will be analyzed immediately, and a tactical team is already en route to secure the location. Mom, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. What does this mean for our family's safety? For Theo's safety? We'll be implementing additional security measures effective immediately, Detective Rivera assured her. And I would strongly advise against any further independent investigations. This last comment was directed pointedly at me. By the time we left the police station, night had fallen. Dad drove home in tense silence, Mom occasionally glancing back at me in the rear seat with an expression that mixed worry with lingering anger. I knew extensive conversations about trust and responsibility awaited me, but my mind was too preoccupied with the implications of what we'd discovered to dread them properly. Someone had built that concrete structure after the police search, knowing I might eventually visit the location. Someone was still out there, still playing whatever twisted game had claimed Heather, Thomas, and who knew how many others. And despite Detective Rivera's assurances, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still somehow central to their plans. That night, as my parents finally finished their lengthy lecture about trust, safety, and the consequences of my actions, I sat at my bedroom window staring out at the darkness. The familiar suburban landscape of our neighborhood seemed suddenly alien and threatening, as though the hollow woods had followed me home. My phone chimed with a text message from an unknown number. "You saw. Now you understand. It was never just Harlan. Look deeper." I showed the message to my parents immediately, honoring my renewed promise of complete transparency. Within an hour, Detective Rivera was at our house confiscating my phone and setting up additional surveillance around our property. "We'll trace this," she promised. "Whoever is reaching out to you has made a tactical error." But deep down I suspected this was no error. Whoever was sending these messages was always one step ahead, always watching, always waiting. The game continued, and somehow, against my will, I remained a player. The following weeks brought increased security but few answers. My phone was returned, wiped, and with a new number known only to immediate family. Police patrols past our house increased, and I was driven to and from school by officers in unmarked cars. The tactical team had found the concrete structure exactly as we'd described it, but completely empty. All equipment, files, and evidence removed, leaving nothing but bare walls. Victor Harlan's death was officially ruled a suicide. Despite the lingering questions about potential accomplices, Heather Wilson remained missing, her fate unknown. The investigation continued, but momentum seemed to be fading as weeks passed without new developments. I tried to return to normal life, focusing on school and deliberately avoiding anything related to Bankhead Forest or the disappearances. But the experience had changed me fundamentally. I noticed security cameras everywhere now, wondered about hidden watchers behind every screen, questioned the official narrative of every news story. 6 weeks after our discovery in the forest, as public interest in the case was waning, I received a letter at school, handwritten on plain paper, slipped into my locker somehow despite the enhanced security measures. Some mysteries solve themselves if you wait long enough. February 16, 2021, patient intake 47291, Huntsville Psychiatric Hospital. I almost discarded it immediately, but something stopped me. A date, February 16, 2021, almost exactly 1 year before our camping trip. And a specific reference to the psychiatric hospital, where my mother occasionally consulted as a visiting psychologist. Instead of taking it to the authorities immediately, I took it to my mother that evening, showing her the note while my father was still at work. Her reaction told me everything. The color drained from her face as she read the cryptic message. "Mom," I prompted when she remained silent. "What does this mean?" She looked up, her professional composure cracking. "Patient 47291, she whispered. It was Heather. The revelation shattered everything we thought we knew. Heather Wilson had been a patient at Huntsville Psychiatric Hospital a year before we encountered her in the forest. My mother had never treated her directly, but recognized the case from staff discussions. A young woman with severe dissociative episodes and paranoid delusions about being watched, monitored, experimented on. She had been committed after being found wandering in Bankhead Forest, claiming to have escaped from observers who were using the woods as a human laboratory. Hospital staff had dismissed her claims as delusions, medicating her heavily until she recanted her story and was eventually released to a halfway house. And the final, most disturbing connection. Victor Harlan had been an orderly at the same hospital during Heather's stay, before returning to his seasonal position with the Forest Service. The truth, when it finally emerged through Detective Rivera's renewed investigation, was more horrifying than any of us had imagined. Harlan had been using his positions at both the hospital and Forest Service to identify and target vulnerable individuals, people whose mental health history meant their disappearances would be attributed to their own instability rather than foul play. The concrete structure we discovered had been Harlan's private monitoring station, where he observed his potential victims before abducting them, using techniques he had learned while working in the psychiatric ward to manipulate and control them. Heather had indeed escaped his captivity shortly before we found her in the woods that winter night. Her disorientation hadn't been from alcohol, but from the medications Harlan had been using to control her. Thomas Keller hadn't been her boyfriend, but another victim who had attempted to help her escape, paying for his courage with his life. And the mysterious messages I had received. They came from a former patient who had escaped Harlan's game years earlier, but had been too traumatized and afraid to come forward until evidence of Harlan's death emerged. She had been trying, in her damaged way, to guide the investigation toward the truth she couldn't speak directly. 1 year after our fateful camping trip, I returned to Bankhead National Forest with my father. Not to the hollow woods where we had found Heather, but to a peaceful clearing where a small memorial now stood, dedicated to the victims who had been identified in Harlan's journal. Heather Wilson's name was among them. Her body had been found 3 months after our discovery, buried near one of Harlan's remote cabins. She had died from exposure the very night we found her. Our efforts to warm her and return her to what we thought was her campsite ultimately futile against the damage already done to her system by Harlan's drugs and the bitter winter cold. The case was officially closed now. Harlan had indeed acted alone. His suicide, prompted by fear of discovery after our encounter with Heather, revealed his activities. The elaborate surveillance system, the concrete structure that appeared after the police search, all were eventually traced to the anonymous informant, the escaped former victim who had been monitoring Harlan for years, gathering evidence while struggling with her own trauma. As Dad and I stood before the memorial, the forest around us was quiet, not the unnatural, watchful silence that had disturbed us during our camping trip, but the peaceful quiet of a wilderness gradually healing. "Do you think we could have saved her?" I asked, the question that had haunted me for a year finally spoken aloud. If we had done something differently that night. Dad placed a hand on my shoulder. "We did everything we could with what we knew at the time. Theo, sometimes that has to be enough." I nodded, understanding now what I couldn't then, that sometimes horror exists not in the supernatural or the fantastical, but in the darkest corners of human nature, and sometimes bearing witness, refusing to look away from that darkness, is the most important thing we can do. As we turned to leave, I took one last look at the memorial, at Heather's name etched in stone. In the hollow woods where the trees had once seemed to watch with malevolent intent, there were now only echoes of what had happened, and the promise that those lost would be remembered, their stories told, their suffering not forgotten. The woods would continue to hold secrets, as all wild places do, but the darkest secret had been brought into the light, the nameless dread given shape and substance, and, finally, justice. I walked back to the car with my father, leaving behind the silent trees and the memories they contained, carrying forward only the hard-won wisdom that comes from confronting true horror and emerging, changed but unbroken, on the other side. It happened during August 2021, though the memory remains as vivid as yesterday. My friend Nora and I had discovered what we considered the perfect camping location that summer. A secluded lean-to situated alongside a pristine lake, approximately 3.5 miles from the nearest parking area. The shelter was part of a larger 20-mile loop trail that meandered through the Adirondack wilderness, connecting a constellation of small glacial lakes, dotted with perhaps half a dozen similar structures constructed in the early 1960s. These public shelters operated under specific regulations that all hikers were required to respect. The most significant rule was the sharing principle. Even if you arrived first and established your camp, you were obligated to accommodate others up to the structure's maximum capacity, typically around 8 people. The surrounding area permitted primitive camping as well, but environmental conditions made such options less appealing. Most of the ground near the lakes transformed into swampland during the summer months, while the remaining terrain proved either too densely forested or too steep for comfortable tent placement. During our first 3 expeditions to this particular lean-to that summer, we'd enjoyed complete solitude. No other hikers had appeared to claim their rightful space beside us. This streak of isolation led us to develop a false sense of ownership over the shelter, a misconception that would ultimately contribute to the horrors we experienced during our 4th visit. Still remember the weight of my pack as we set off that morning. The sky brilliant blue with scattered clouds promising perfect hiking weather. Nora carried most of our food supplies while I managed the tent, as backup in case the lean-to was occupied, water filtration system, and cooking equipment. The hike itself was moderately challenging, with enough elevation changes to make us appreciate each rest stop, where we'd listen to the forest, birds calling, leaves rustling, the occasional splash from nearby streams. We reached the lean-to around 3 p.m., gratified to find it empty once again. The three-sided wooden structure faced the lake, offering a perfect view of the water glimmering under the afternoon sun. We unpacked efficiently, arranging our sleeping gear on the raised wooden platform and hanging our food bag from a nearby tree, standard practice to deter wildlife. Neither of us could have anticipated that our greatest threats would come not from animals, but from the other humans who would soon join us in this remote wilderness location. As evening approached, Nora and I prepared a simple dinner of dehydrated stew on our small camp stove. The lake had begun to reflect the sunset's orange and pink hues when we heard voices approaching from the trail. 2 men emerged from the tree line, heavily burdened with equipment that appeared excessive for typical backpackers. The taller man, who introduced himself as Wesley, approached with a forced smile that never reached his eyes. His companion Hudson remained silent, assessing our setup with calculated interest. "Looks like we're bunkmates tonight," Wesley announced, dropping his pack with unnecessary force. His tone suggested this arrangement displeased him as much as it suddenly did us. They claimed the opposite side of the lean-to, arranging their gear with military precision. Neither seemed interested in the usual trail conversations about routes taken or wildlife spotted. Instead, they whispered intensely between themselves, falling silent whenever I moved within earshot. As darkness descended, the temperature dropped significantly. The forest transformed around us, daytime woodland sounds replaced by unfamiliar nocturnal utterances. An owl hooted somewhere nearby, its call seeming to echo across the lake's surface. Normally, these natural sounds would provide comfort, reminding me of nature's continuous cycles. That night, however, every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves heightened my growing unease. Around midnight, I awoke to the sound of hushed movement. Through half-closed eyes, I observed Hudson removing something from a hidden compartment in his backpack. The object gleamed momentarily in the moonlight filtering through the trees, the unmistakable silhouette of a handgun. My breathing became shallow as I forced myself to remain motionless, feigning sleep while my heart hammered against my ribcage. Wesley joined him outside the lean-to. Their whispered conversation carried fragments to where I lay frozen. "Perimeter check and make sure we're alone," drifted back to me. They disappeared into the surrounding forest, leaving Nora and me temporarily alone. I frantically shook Nora awake, clamping my hand over her mouth to prevent any sound. Her eyes widened as I whispered our situation. We quickly debated our options: flee immediately or pretend we'd noticed nothing unusual. The unknown factors paralyzed us. Were they hiding from someone? Protecting themselves from perceived threats? Or did they have more sinister intentions toward us? The complete darkness beyond our shelter suddenly seemed more threatening than whatever uncertain danger our companions presented. We decided to stay put until daylight, maintaining our charade of obliviousness. Neither of us slept again that night, listening intently as the men returned and eventually settled into their sleeping bags, the weapon now concealed but undoubtedly within reach. Dawn arrived with excruciating slowness. As first light filtered through the trees, I examined our surroundings with new awareness. Wesley and Hudson had positioned their sleeping area to maintain clear sight lines to both the trail and the lake, strategic rather than scenic considerations. Their equipment, now visible in daylight, included communications gear more sophisticated than typical emergency devices, and their food supplies suggested preparation for a much longer stay than ordinary recreational campers. While preparing breakfast, I accidentally knocked over Wesley's pack. As I hurriedly restored its contents, my fingers brushed against something that sent electric fear through my body: a small notebook containing what appeared to be surveillance notes. Dates, times, and locations were meticulously documented in cramped handwriting. Several entries mentioned a female subject and target acquisition. The final entry from the previous day noted, "Potential witnesses at designated location. Reassessing approach." I replaced the notebook with trembling hands, suddenly understanding with terrifying clarity that Nora and I had inadvertently stumbled into something dangerous, perhaps a stakeout or planned confrontation of some kind. Our very presence had disrupted whatever operation these men were conducting. Wesley emerged from the forest with freshly filtered water, his demeanor surprisingly congenial in the morning light. "Beautiful day ahead," he remarked casually. "You two planning to stay another night?" The question carried an undercurrent I couldn't miss. He wanted to know our timeline, perhaps to recalibrate their own plans. I manufactured a light-hearted response about continuing along the loop trail, deliberately vague about our intended direction or distance. Hudson joined us, preparing coffee with methodical precision. His gaze repeatedly drifted to the northeast shoreline of the lake, approximately half a mile distant. Through breaks in the trees there, I could just make out another lean-to structure. Someone appeared to be moving around it, though the distance made identification impossible. "Company across the way," I observed innocently, testing their reaction. Hudson's posture stiffened momentarily before he forced relaxation. "Just noticed that myself," he replied, his tone carefully neutral. As the morning progressed, Nora and I silently communicated our mounting anxiety through meaningful glances and subtle gestures. We began packing our gear, moving with deliberate efficiency that concealed our growing desperation to distance ourselves from these men and whatever situation we had unwittingly entered. By mid-morning, Nora and I had fabricated a plausible reason to depart, mentioning a predetermined meeting with fictional friends at another lake further along the trail. We shouldered our packs with feigned enthusiasm, hyper-aware of Wesley's penetrating stare as we departed. Once beyond sight of the lean-to, we abandoned the main trail, cutting through dense undergrowth to circle back toward the parking area via an alternate route. The deviation added significant distance to our journey, but felt necessary to avoid being followed. At a stream crossing approximately 2 miles from our starting point, we encountered a woman in her 50s, sitting alone on a large boulder, her hiking boots removed to reveal blistered feet. She introduced herself as Beatrice, her expression brightening at the unexpected company. Her solitary presence struck me as unusual. Most hikers in this remote region traveled with companions for safety. "Thank goodness," she said, her voice carrying notes of genuine relief. "I thought I might be stuck out here another night. My hiking partner left yesterday after we had a disagreement." She gestured vaguely north. "I've been at the Cedar Lake lean-to, and I swear something's been circling it for 2 nights straight." "Something?" I queried, immediately recalling Hudson's interest in the northeast shoreline. "You'll think I'm ridiculous," Beatrice continued, "but I'm certain it was a Sasquatch, too large for a bear, moving bipedally but definitely not human." She laughed nervously at her own claim. "I know how it sounds, but I've been hiking these woods for 30 years. I know the difference between animal movements and something else." Under different circumstances, I might have dismissed her account as the imaginative interpretation of normal woodland sounds amplified by solitude and darkness. However, after our experience with Wesley and Hudson, her story acquired an alternative explanation that seemed far more plausible, and potentially more terrifying. "This creature," I ventured carefully, "did it seem interested in your campsite specifically? Or more like it was watching something else nearby?" Beatrice's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "Now that you mention it, it never approached directly. Always maintained distance, circling widely. Almost like..." She paused, recognition dawning. "Almost like it was watching the opposite shoreline, where the next lean-to is located." Nora and I exchanged knowing glances. The creature Beatrice had interpreted as Sasquatch was almost certainly one of our lean-to companions conducting surveillance, using the darkness and forest cover to observe whoever occupied the shelter across the lake. "Have you seen anyone unusual during your stay?" Nora asked. "Anyone who seemed out of place or particularly interested in that area?" Beatrice's expression transformed from confusion to alarm as we described Wesley and Hudson, their equipment and behavior. "There were 2 men," she confirmed slowly. "They arrived 3 days ago, claimed to be birdwatchers. Spent 1 night at my lean-to before continuing deeper into the wilderness, as they put it. Something about them felt wrong, too prepared, too aware. The puzzle pieces were connecting in my mind, forming a picture I desperately wished to unsee." Whatever operation these men were conducting involved watching, or worse, confronting, whoever occupied the lean-to across from our original campsite. And now they knew we could potentially identify them. We invited Beatrice to join us for the remainder of our hike out, an offer she gratefully accepted. Safety in numbers seemed prudent, though I questioned whether 3 unarmed hikers would present any meaningful deterrent if Wesley and Hudson had truly sinister intentions. As we progressed along the trail, afternoon shadows lengthened around us. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf amplified our collective anxiety. Conversation diminished to essential communication, warnings about slippery rocks or low-hanging branches. Our pace accelerated beyond wisdom, risking twisted ankles on the uneven terrain. Approximately halfway to the parking area, we encountered a designated rest spot, a small clearing with crude log benches. We paused briefly, allowing Beatrice to tend to her blistered feet. While she applied moleskin to the worst spots, I scanned our surroundings, the sensation of being observed intensifying with each passing minute. Movement caught my eye, a flash of unnatural color against the forest's green and brown palette. Someone was paralleling our route through the trees, maintaining enough distance to remain mostly concealed but close enough to track our progress. "We need to move," I whispered urgently. "Someone's following us." Nora immediately understood, helping Beatrice quickly replace her boots while I created a diversion, loudly discussing a fabricated plan to camp at the next lean-to along the main trail. We departed in that direction, maintaining the charade until we reached a fork in the path, then abruptly diverted onto a less-traveled side trail that would eventually reconnect with the parking area via a more circuitous route. The alternative path proved more challenging, less maintained, with numerous blowdowns requiring us to climb over or crawl under fallen trees. The physical demands, however, paled compared to the psychological strain of constant vigilance. Every 100 yards we paused to listen, attempting to detect pursuit. After one such pause, the forest's silence shattered with the unmistakable crack of a gunshot, followed immediately by a second report. The sounds emanated from the direction of the main trail, precisely where we would have been had we continued on our original path. Beatrice stifled a cry of alarm as I pulled both women down into a dense thicket of underbrush. We lay perfectly still, barely breathing as distant voices carried faintly through the trees. Though indistinct, the tone conveyed frustration and urgency. "They're hunting us," Nora whispered, her voice barely audible. "They think we know something." "Or they believe we've seen something we shouldn't have," I responded, my mind racing through possible scenarios. Whatever's happening at that other lean-to, they can't risk witnesses. We remained hidden until twilight descended, transforming the forest into a landscape of deepening shadows and amorphous shapes. Moving in darkness presented new dangers, but the greater threat now came from those who pursued us with lethal intent. Navigating the forest in near-total darkness required using our phone flashlights sparingly, brief illuminations to check trail markers before continuing by feel and instinct. The waning moon provided minimal assistance, its faint glow filtering through the canopy to cast ghostly patterns on the forest floor. Our progress slowed dramatically, each step requiring careful placement to avoid noisy missteps or injuries. Beatrice's labored breathing betrayed her exhaustion, but she persevered without complaint, understanding the gravity of our situation. Around 10 p.m., we reached a small stream that cut across the trail. Under normal circumstances, crossing would have been trivial, a simple matter of stepping across strategically placed rocks. In darkness, with fatigue clouding our judgment and fear accelerating our heartbeats, it became a formidable obstacle. I tested each rock before committing my weight, acutely aware that a fall would produce noise we couldn't afford. Midway across, I froze at a sound that didn't belong to the natural forest symphony, the distinctive electronic chirp of a radio communication device, followed by the faint murmur of a human voice. The sound originated somewhere to our right, perhaps 50 yards distant. They had anticipated our route, positioning themselves to intercept us before we could reach safety. The realization triggered a surge of primal fear unlike anything I'd previously experienced. We were prey, being methodically hunted by predators who knew these woods as well as we did. I signaled silently to Nora and Beatrice to remain motionless. For several excruciatingly long minutes, We stood immobile on the stream's rocks, water rushing around our boots, bodies rigid with tension as we strained to detect any approach. When it came, the sound startled us despite our vigilance, a deliberate footstep perhaps 20 yards upstream, followed by the beam of a powerful flashlight sweeping across the water. The light missed us by mere feet, continuing past to illuminate the opposite bank before extinguishing. Instinctively, we sank lower, using the stream's natural sounds to mask our movements as we abandoned the crossing, instead wading directly downstream. The frigid water soaked through our pants and boots, but hypothermia seemed a distant concern compared to the immediate threat behind us. We maintained this aquatic escape for nearly quarter of a mile before finding a suitable exit point, where dense vegetation would conceal our emergence. Waterlogged and shivering, we continued through the forest, now completely disoriented but driven by the fundamental understanding that distance, any distance from our pursuers, was our only hope for survival. By midnight, exhaustion threatened to overwhelm our survival instincts. Beatrice's condition particularly concerned me. Her pace had slowed considerably and occasional whimpers escaped her lips despite evident efforts to remain silent. We needed shelter and rest, yet stopping anywhere within these woods seemed tantamount to surrender. A distant pinpoint of light through the trees presented either tremendous risk or unexpected salvation. After brief consultation, we decided to approach cautiously, recognizing that even unknown humans might provide sanctuary from the specific threat we fled. The light emanated from a small cabin approximately 200 yards from the trail, likely a ranger station or maintenance outpost for park services. We observed from concealment for nearly 30 minutes, confirming only one occupant moved within. When we finally approached, the door opened before we reached it. A woman in a Park Service uniform regarded us with obvious surprise, her flashlight beam playing across our bedraggled appearances. "You folks look like you've had quite a night," she observed, her tone professional but concerned. She introduced herself as Ranger Juliana, explaining that this remote station monitored wildlife activity and maintained trails in this section of the wilderness. Inside the sparse but wonderfully warm cabin, we recounted our experience in halting, exhausted fragments. Ranger Juliana's expression grew increasingly grave as our story unfolded. "This isn't the first report we've had," she revealed, retrieving a logbook from a nearby shelf. "3 separate incidents in the past month, hikers reporting individuals with suspicious equipment, seemingly conducting surveillance rather than recreational activities." She radioed her headquarters, providing our descriptions of Wesley and Hudson, along with their last known location. The response was immediate. Park authorities had been collaborating with state police regarding similar reports, suspecting these individuals were connected to a multi-state fugitive situation. "A federal witness is being hidden in a remote cabin in this general area," Juliana explained after ending the radio communication. "Law enforcement believes someone leaked the approximate location, and these men are likely contracted to locate the witness." The revelation crystallized everything we had observed: the surveillance equipment, the strategic positioning, the willingness to eliminate anyone who might compromise their operation. We had unwittingly wandered into a deadly serious manhunt, becoming potential collateral damage in a high-stakes criminal enterprise. We remained at the ranger station through the night, the doors securely locked and Ranger Juliana maintaining vigilant watch with her service weapon readily accessible. None of us slept meaningfully, instead drifting in and out of uneasy consciousness as adrenaline gradually ebbed from our systems. Dawn arrived with the distant thrum of helicopter rotors, state police aerial units beginning systematic searches of the area based on the information we had provided. Juliana's radio crackled continuously with updates as law enforcement converged on the wilderness from multiple access points. By mid-morning, confirmation came through. 2 suspects matching our descriptions had been intercepted attempting to leave the forest via an unmaintained access road several miles north of our original camping location. A subsequent search of their vehicle revealed multiple weapons, sophisticated surveillance equipment, and documentation linking them to organized crime entities in 3 states. Our statements were taken by stern-faced officers who arrived at the ranger station around noon. They revealed little additional information, but emphasized the significance of our observations and quick thinking. Had Wesley and Hudson successfully located their target, The consequences would have extended far beyond our personal safety. As we were finally escorted from the forest under police protection, I gazed back at the tree line that had concealed such unexpected dangers. The wilderness had always represented escape and solitude for me, a respite from the complexities of modern life. Now it held a darker dimension in my perception, a reminder that human predators could transform even the most pristine natural settings into theaters of terror. Beatrice parted from us at the main ranger station, her belief in Sasquatch replaced by the far more disturbing knowledge of what actually stalked her campsite those nights. Her parting words have remained with me since. I'd have preferred my monster to be fictional after all. In the years since that August, I've returned to hiking and wilderness camping, refusing to surrender my connection to nature because of one horrific experience. But I've never returned to that particular trail system, and I'm not certain I ever will. Some places become permanently altered in our minds, transformed from spaces of beauty into landscapes of memory where fear left indelible marks on our perception. The lean-to remains there, I'm told, still offering shelter to tired hikers who arrive seeking communion with nature's tranquility. I wonder sometimes if they sense anything unusual as darkness falls, any whisper of the terror that once circled through those trees, wearing human form but possessed of inhuman intent. Some nights I still wake suddenly, certain I've heard the snap of a twig outside my window, or detected movement in the shadows beyond. The true horror, I've discovered, isn't what might be lurking in the darkness of remote forests. It's the knowledge, carried forever afterward, of what humans are capable of when they believe themselves unobserved in those same shadows. I first set foot at YMCA Camp St. Croix when I was 10 years old. Back in 2018, the sprawling campgrounds sit nestled against the Wisconsin side of the St. Croix River, where tall pine trees stand like ancient sentinels against the sky. I remember the excitement of my parents dropping me off that first summer, the smell of pine needles and river water filling my lungs as I stepped out of our family sedan, duffel bag clutched tightly in my small hands. What began as nervous anticipation quickly blossomed into a love affair with Camp St. Croix. I returned faithfully every summer, each visit layering new memories atop the old ones. The wooden cabins with their squeaky screen doors, the dining hall's perpetually sticky tables, the swimming area cordoned off by faded red and white buoys. These became as familiar to me as the rooms of my own home. By my third summer, I had graduated from being a wide-eyed newcomer to something of a camp veteran. The counselors knew me by name, and I navigated the winding forest paths with confidence that bordered on cockiness. What I didn't know then, what none of us fully appreciated, was the complicated history of the land beneath our feet. The camp director, Thomas, was a broad-shouldered man in his 40s with a booming voice that could silence a rowdy mess hall without effort. During my fourth summer, he gathered all the campers for the traditional welcome night campfire. As flames licked upward into the darkening sky, he shared something he'd never mentioned before. "This land we're on," he said, his voice unusually solemn, "has been many things before it became our camp. Long before any buildings stood here, this was the territory of the Dakota people." Thomas went on to explain that decades earlier, when the camp was first established, a Dakota elder had visited the original owners. The elder informed them they were building on sacred ground, land that held deep significance to his people. According to Thomas, the camp founders acknowledged this history, but proceeded with their plans anyway. "We try to honor the land's history now," Thomas concluded, "but it's important to remember we're guests here in many ways." That night in my bunk, I found myself thinking about the land beneath me. How many feet had walked it before mine? How many eyes had gazed at these same stars? I didn't know then how this awareness would color everything that would happen in the summers to come. By the summer of 2019, I had turned 11 and considered myself practically grown. This was the year the stories began, or perhaps I had simply become old enough to be included when they were told. The older campers, particularly the 13 and 14-year-olds, had a tradition of sharing spooky tales after lights out. My cabin counselor that year was Michael, a college sophomore studying environmental science who had been coming to St. Croix since he was a child himself. Michael generally enforced lights out with reasonable strictness, but on Friday nights, He'd pretend not to notice our flashlights switching on beneath blankets as whispered stories circulated through the cabin. Have you heard about the shadow people? Noah, a lanky 13-year-old with a massive curly hair, asked one such night. I remember how the flashlight beneath his chin cast eerie shadows across his face. They're tall, skinny figures that hide in the trees, he continued. Some of the older counselors have seen them. They stay just at the edge of your vision watching. Tyler, my bunkmate, rolled his eyes. That's just the Slender Man story. That was popular like 5 years ago. Noah shook his head emphatically. No, this is different. These have been spotted here at this camp for decades, way before that internet stuff. I listened with growing unease as Noah described the shadow figures, how they moved with unnatural quickness, how they seemed to absorb light rather than merely block it. According to him, they were most often spotted near Whispering Pines, an older section of the camp that was rarely used anymore except for advanced wilderness training. My brother was a counselor here 3 years ago, Noah continued. He told me about a night hike where 5 kids and their counselor all saw the same thing, black figures moving between the trees. Then something huge flew over them like man-shaped but massive, and they felt the ground shake. That's just a story, Tyler insisted, but his voice had lost some of its skepticism. Ask William, Noah countered. He was the counselor with that group. He still works here. I felt a chill despite the summer warmth. William was indeed still at the camp. He was the senior counselor who led the advanced canoeing lessons I had been taking. He was well liked and respected, not the type to make up stories for attention. Maybe we should ask him, I suggested, surprised by my own boldness. Noah flicked off his flashlight as footsteps approached our cabin. Lights out for real, guys, Michael's voice called through the screen door. Big day tomorrow. As I drifted toward sleep that night, the image of dark figures moving between pine trees played behind my eyelids. I told myself it was just a campfire story, the kind that every summer camp collects over the years. But deep down, a seed of unease had been planted, one that would grow in the days to come. The next morning at breakfast, I found myself studying William from across the dining hall. He was in his mid-20s with sun-bleached hair and the perpetual tan of someone who lived outdoors. Nothing about him suggested someone prone to flights of fancy or exaggeration. If anything, he was known for his practical, matter-of-fact approach to everything from teaching knot tying to handling homesick campers. During free period that afternoon, I made my way to the boathouse where William was inventorying life jackets. I pretended to be interested in signing up for an extra canoeing session, but after a few minutes of awkward small talk, I found the courage to ask what was really on my mind. Is it true about the shadow people in Whispering Pines? I blurted out. William's hand stilled on the life jacket he was examining. For a moment he said nothing, and I feared he would dismiss me with a laugh or a reprimand about spreading ghost stories. Instead, he set the life jacket aside and regarded me with unexpected seriousness. Who told you about that? He asked quietly. Noah said his brother was here when you saw them, I answered, suddenly uncertain if I should have brought it up. William sighed and glanced around, confirming we were alone in the boathouse. Look, he said finally, I don't talk about this much because it sounds crazy, and counselors aren't supposed to feed into camp ghost stories. But something did happen a few years ago. He described leading a night hike with 6 middle schoolers, all experienced campers. They had been practicing navigation by stars, following a path through the older section of camp where the trees grew closer together and the undergrowth was less managed. We were heading back, had almost reached the main trail, when Benjamin spotted something moving between the trees, William recounted. At first I thought it was deer. We see plenty of them around dusk. But when I looked, William's description matched Noah's story in broad strokes. Dark, elongated figures that seemed to flit between the trees with unnatural speed and coordination. What Noah hadn't mentioned was the sound, or rather, the profound absence of it. The woods went completely silent, William told me. No insects, no birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. And then there was this pressure, like right before a thunderstorm breaks, except it didn't break. It just built until my ears felt like they might pop. The 6 kids had huddled together, frightened by the sudden stillness and their counselor's obvious tension. That's when something large had moved overhead. momentarily blotting out the stars visible through the canopy. The ground vibrated, William said. Not like an earthquake. More like standing near train tracks when a freight train passes. We all felt it. After the incident, they had hurried back to the main camp. William reported what happened to the camp director, who listened sympathetically, but suggested they might have encountered a large owl, or perhaps been spooked by natural phenomena combined with the power of suggestion. But all 7 of you saw and felt the same things? I asked. William nodded. We did. And here's the thing that really got to me afterward. When I researched local history, I found out that particular area was once used for Dakota ceremonies. One account described spirits that guarded the boundary between worlds. Tall, silent watchers that moved through trees. He must have noticed my widening eyes because he quickly added, that doesn't mean we saw anything supernatural. Our minds are powerful things. They can interpret unfamiliar stimuli in ways that match our expectations or fears. Before I could ask any more questions, a group of campers arrived for their scheduled canoe lesson. William gave me a significant look as he stood up. Just be respectful if you're ever in the older parts of camp, he said quietly. That's good advice regardless of whether you believe in shadow people or not. The conversation with William left me both fascinated and unsettled. Over the next few days, I found myself paying closer attention to the stories that circulated among the campers. What I had previously dismissed as typical summer camp folklore now held a kernel of potential truth. During library time, a twice-weekly period when campers could read or write letters home, I began researching the history of the area. The camp's small library contained several books on local history, including one thin volume about the indigenous peoples who had inhabited the St. Croix River Valley. The Dakota had indeed lived in this region for centuries before European settlement. The book was frustratingly vague about specific beliefs or practices, written with the superficial gloss of someone documenting curiosities rather than living traditions. Still, there were mentions of guardian spirits and sacred sites along the river. One particular passage caught my attention. Dakota oral traditions speak of boundary keepers, entities that stand between the physical and spiritual realms. These guardians were said to appear as elongated shadows, visible only in peripheral vision or in moments between day and night. I showed the passage to my friend Zoe, who had been at camp as long as I had. Her response surprised me. My sister was a counselor here before she went to college, Zoe said. She used to talk about threshold experiences. That's what the older staff called them. Times when they felt like they were being watched in certain parts of the camp. Did she ever see anything? I asked. Zoe shrugged. She said once she saw what looked like a person standing between 2 pine trees, but when she turned to look directly, there was nothing there. When she turned away, she could see it again from the corner of her eye. Throughout that week, I collected more stories, some secondhand, some from campers claiming personal experiences. A pattern emerged. The sightings always occurred in the older sections of camp, particularly near Whispering Pines. They happened most frequently at dawn, dusk, or on nights with a new moon. The figures never approached or threatened anyone. They simply observed from a distance. Thomas, the camp director, noticed my interest in local history and pulled me aside after dinner one evening. I've heard you've been asking about the camp's past, he said, his voice carefully neutral. Anything specific you're curious about? I hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal about my growing obsession with the shadow people stories. Just interested in who was here before us, I said finally. And if there are any special places we should know about. Thomas studied me for a long moment before responding. This land has history worth respecting, he said finally. The Dakota considered certain areas sacred, places where the boundary between worlds grew thin. We try to honor that by treading lightly and teaching respect for nature. He didn't explicitly confirm or deny the stories, but something in his tone suggested he knew more than he was saying. Before walking away, he added one more comment that would stick with me. The old-timers who first built this camp ignored warnings they should have heeded. We try not to make the same mistakes. As July progressed, our counselors announced an overnight canoe trip planned for the older campers, a 2-night expedition down the St. Croix River to a primitive campsite. I had been looking forward to this trip all summer, having finally qualified for the advanced canoeing group. Our party consisted of 12 campers and 3 counselors, William, Michael, and a new counselor named Grace who specialized in wilderness first aid. We packed our gear into waterproof bags, loaded the canoes at dawn, and pushed off into the misty river. The journey downriver took most of the day, with stops for lunch and swimming at a sandy beach. Despite my growing preoccupation with the shadow stories, the physical demands of paddling and the beauty of the river pushed those thoughts to the background. By late afternoon, we reached our destination, a cleared area on the riverbank surrounded by old-growth pines. The campsite was primitive but well-established, with a fire ring, crude benches fashioned from logs, and an outhouse set back in the trees. We worked together to set up tents, gather firewood, and prepare dinner over the open flame. As darkness fell, the mood was cheerful and relaxed. William led us in camp songs while Michael distributed ingredients for s'mores. It wasn't until the fire burned down to embers and counselors began suggesting it was time for sleep that I remembered where we were, deep in the woods, away from the safety of the main camp, surrounded by darkness broken only by our flashlights and the stars above. The outhouse stood at the end of a gravel path about 50 yards from our campsite. Before turning in, several of us needed to use it. Rather than going alone, Tyler, Samuel, and I decided to walk together, our flashlight beams bouncing through the darkness. "Did you hear that?" Samuel whispered as we neared the halfway point. We stopped listening. The night was filled with normal forest sounds, the rustle of leaves, distant owl calls, the gentle lapping of the river against the shore. But beneath those familiar noises was something else, a rhythmic sound almost like breathing, but slower and deeper than any human or animal I could imagine. "It's just the wind," Tyler said, but he didn't sound convinced. We continued walking, our pace quickening slightly. The gravel crunched beneath our shoes, suddenly seeming too loud in the quiet forest. The outhouse came into view, its wooden structure a dark silhouette against the slightly less dark background of trees. That's when I saw it. Standing beside the outhouse was a figure. At first glance, it seemed human-shaped, roughly the height and proportions of an adult man. But something was profoundly wrong about it. In the beam of my flashlight, it didn't reflect light as a solid object should. Instead, the light seemed to pass through it in places while other parts absorbed the beam completely. We all stopped. The figure remained motionless, oriented toward us, though I couldn't distinguish any features that might be a face. The feeling that washed over me defies easy description. Not exactly fear, though fear was certainly part of it. Rather, it was a profound sensation of wrongness, of encountering something that should not exist within the natural order I understood. Time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously. I don't know if we stood frozen for seconds or minutes. Then Tyler gasped, and the sound broke whatever spell had fallen over us. The figure, if it had ever truly been there, was gone. Not as if it had run away or moved out of sight, but as if it had simply ceased to be. "Did you see that?" Samuel's voice was barely audible. Tyler and I both nodded, neither of us capable of forming words. The forest sounds had returned to normal, the rhythmic breathing sound now absent. After a long moment, Tyler squared his shoulders. "I still need to use the bathroom," he said with forced casualness. "It was probably just shadows and our eyes playing tricks." He continued down the path alone while Samuel and I waited, too shaken to follow but unwilling to return to camp without him. When Tyler emerged from the outhouse minutes later, his face was pale but composed. "Nothing in there," he reported. "Just a smelly outhouse." We returned to camp in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. That night I lay awake in my tent, listening to the forest sounds and wondering what exactly we had witnessed. It wasn't a deer on its hind legs, the proportions were all wrong. It wasn't another camper, no one had gone ahead of us, and it certainly wasn't a normal shadow, not the way it had interacted with our flashlight beams. What struck me most, thinking back on the encounter, was the absence of malevolence. Whatever we had seen hadn't moved toward us or made any threatening gesture. It had simply been there watching, as if curious about our presence. None of us slept well that night. When dawn finally broke, I emerged from my tent to find Tyler and Samuel already sitting by the rekindled fire, speaking in low voices that fell silent as I approached. "Did you tell anyone?" I asked, settling beside them. Tyler shook his head. "They'd just say we spooked ourselves." But we all saw it, Samuel insisted. It wasn't just one of us imagining things. We debated whether to mention the encounter to the counselors, but ultimately decided against it. William had already shared his experience with me, but Michael and Grace might not be as understanding. Besides, nothing had actually happened. We'd seen something strange, but none of us had been harmed or even approached. The second day passed without incident. We hiked a nearby trail, practiced wilderness skills, and swam in a calm section of the river. As evening approached, I noticed the counselors huddled together in conversation, occasionally glancing toward the woods. When William approached our group with an unusual expression, I wondered if someone had reported our experience after all. "Change of plans for tonight," he announced to everyone. "We're going to do a night awareness exercise. Pairs of campers will take 30-minute shifts keeping watch over the camp while others sleep." This was not a standard activity on overnight trips, and from the expressions on Tyler's and Samuel's faces, they were thinking the same thing I was. Something had the counselors concerned. When we had a moment alone, I approached William. "Is this because of what happened at the outhouse last night?" I asked directly. William looked startled. "You saw something?" I described what the three of us had witnessed. William listened without interrupting, his expression growing increasingly serious. "I didn't know about that," he said when I finished. "But Grace thought she saw someone watching our campsite from the trees last night. When she went to investigate, there was no one there, but she found footprints that didn't match any of our shoes." "Do you think it's the shadow people?" I whispered. William's mouth tightened. "I don't know what to think, but I'm not taking chances with anyone's safety, hence the watch shifts." I was paired with Noah for the midnight watch. We sat by the embers of the fire, taking turns scanning the darkness surrounding our camp. The night was cloudy, with only occasional glimpses of stars when the cloud cover briefly parted. Our flashlights created small islands of light that made the surrounding darkness seem even deeper. "What do you think they are?" Noah asked after we'd been sitting in silence for some time. "The shadows?" I didn't need to clarify. It was clear what he meant. "Yeah. Do you think they're ghosts? Or something else?" I considered the question carefully. "I don't know. William told me this area was sacred to the Dakota, a place where the boundary between worlds was thin. Maybe there's some kind of guardians watching to make sure we respect the land?" Noah nodded slowly. "That makes more sense than them being harmful. If they wanted to hurt people, they've had plenty of chances over the years." Our conversation fell silent as a twig snapped in the darkness beyond our light. We both tensed, flashlights swinging toward the sound. For a moment I thought I saw movement, the same light-absorbing quality of the figure by the outhouse, but it was gone before I could focus on it. "Did you see that?" Noah whispered. I nodded, throat too dry for speech. We spent the remainder of our watch in tense silence, jumping at every forest sound. Nothing else appeared, but the feeling of being observed never faded. When William and Grace came to relieve us, I was almost dizzy with relief. "Anything to report?" William asked quietly. "Maybe something moving in the trees," I said, unwilling to sound definitive. "Just for a second." William nodded as if this confirmed something he already suspected. "Get some sleep. We'll break camp at first light." We awoke to fog so thick it transformed the familiar campsite into something otherworldly. Tendrils of mist wound between the trees and hovered above the river's surface. The usual morning bird song was muted, creating an unnatural hush that no one seemed eager to break. The counselors had us pack quickly, skipping the usual hot breakfast in favor of granola bars and fruit eaten as we worked. No one complained about the change in plans or the rapid departure. Something had shifted in the group's collective mood, a shared understanding that it was time to leave this place. As we loaded the canoes, I noticed Grace kneeling by the edge of camp examining something on the ground. Curiosity drew me over. "What did you find?" I asked. She startled slightly, then gestured to what she'd been studying. In the soft earth were several distinct impressions. Footprints, but unlike any I'd seen before. They were roughly human in shape, but too narrow, with toes that seemed slightly too long and widely spaced. "Animal tracks?" I suggested, though I knew they weren't. Grace met my eyes. "No animal I'm familiar with," she said quietly. "And I grew up hunting with my father." She stood, brushing dirt from her knees. "Don't mention these to the others," she said. "No need to start a panic. We're leaving anyway." The paddle back upstream was strenuous, requiring all our concentration and physical effort. The fog burned off by mid-morning, replaced by bright sunshine that seemed to wash away the unease of the previous night. By the time we reached the main camp's dock, the experiences at the remote campsite had begun to take on a dreamlike quality. That evening at dinner, our group was quieter than usual, though no one explicitly discussed what had or hadn't happened on our trip. The counselors reported the excursion as a success to Thomas, mentioning only that they'd cut it slightly short due to concerns about changing weather conditions. Later, I found Tyler and Samuel sitting on the dock, watching the sunset paint the river in shades of gold and crimson. I joined them, dangling my feet above the water. "Do you think what we saw was real?" Samuel asked after a long silence. "I don't know," Tyler admitted. "In the daylight it seems crazy, but last night, it was real," I said with more certainty than I felt. "We all saw it." "But what was it?" Samuel pressed. I thought about the footprints Grace had found, about William's experience years earlier, about the Dakota elder who had warned the original camp founders. "I think they're watchers," I said finally. "Guardians of some boundary we don't fully understand. I don't think they mean us harm. They just want us to remember this isn't really our land. We're guests here." Tyler and Samuel considered this, neither agreeing nor disagreeing. As the last light faded from the sky, we made our way back to the cabins, each carrying our own version of what we'd experienced. 5 years have passed since that summer at Camp St. Croix. I'm 16 now, no longer the wide-eyed child who first encountered the shadows in the pines. I've returned to the camp each summer, drawn back by both the good memories and the lingering questions from that canoe trip. The strange experiences didn't end with that expedition. Over the years, I've collected more stories from counselors and longtime campers. Most describe similar encounters. Glimpses of tall, dark figures at the periphery of vision, unusual stillness in the forest, footprints that don't quite match human patterns. Always at a distance, always observing rather than interacting. William left the camp 2 summers ago to pursue graduate studies in anthropology, focusing specifically on indigenous spiritual beliefs of the upper Midwest. Before he left, he shared his research with me, accounts from various tribes describing guardian entities that protected sacred sites, particularly those near water. These weren't described as malevolent spirits, but rather as necessary boundaries between worlds that needed to be respected. I've developed my own theory over time. I don't believe what we encountered were ghosts in the traditional sense, nor do I think they were figments of our imagination. The consistency of the experiences across decades, witnessed by different people who often had no knowledge of previous sightings, suggests something genuinely present. What I've come to believe is that the shadows represent something our modern minds struggle to categorize, an aspect of reality that exists alongside our own, but operates according to different rules. The Dakota understood this, incorporating these entities into their worldview as guardians and threshold keepers. When I think back to that night by the outhouse, what stands out isn't the fear, though that was certainly present, but the profound sense of recognition. For just a moment, I glimpsed something beyond ordinary experience, a reminder that the world is vaster and more mysterious than our daily lives acknowledge. I don't share these stories to frighten anyone. If anything, my experiences have left me with a deep sense of peace. The shadows in the pines have never harmed anyone at Camp St. Croix. They simply remind us through their quiet presence that we share this land with more than just the visible creatures of forest and river. Last summer, I became a junior counselor, responsible for guiding younger campers through their first experiences away from home. When they ask me if the camp has any ghost stories, I'm careful in my response. I tell them the land has history worth respecting. I teach them to walk softly on the trails, to thank the river for its gifts, to leave natural spaces as they found them. Sometimes, when I lead evening hikes near Whispering Pines, I feel that familiar sensation of being observed. I no longer find it frightening. Instead, I acknowledge the watchers with a small nod, one guardian recognizing another across an ancient threshold. The shadows remain, as they have for centuries before the camp existed and will for centuries after we're gone. They are not our enemies or our friends. They simply are. A reminder that some boundaries deserve our respect even when we don't fully understand them.